how did BDS, a non-violent movement, become such a strategic challenge to Israel, a country with immense military power, including a nuclear arsenal, economic strength sustained by billions of dollars in your tax money and that of Germany and others, and decades-long impunity for its egregious violations of international law. Representing the overwhelming majority of Palestinians in historic Palestine, as well as in the diaspora, the broadest Palestinian coalition in history launched the BDS movement in 2005 as a key element of Palestinian popular resistance and the most effective form of international solidarity with our quest for freedom, justice, and equality. What does BDS call for? Well, first, an end to the 1967 occupation, Gaza, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, dismantling Israel's institutionalized and legalized system of racial domination and segregation, which meets the United Nations definition of apartheid, and upholding the internationally recognized right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and lands from which they were uprooted and dispossessed during the 1947-1948 Nakba. Israel's most important human rights organization, B'Tselem, has recently joined many Palestinian and international organizations and analysts in understanding Israel's regime against all Palestinians as, quote, a regime of Jewish supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, an apartheid regime. The three BDS demands that I mentioned address the basic rights of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, who make up some 38% of the Palestinian people, Palestinian citizens of Israel, who make up around 12%, and Palestinians in the diaspora, who make up 50% of our people. About 2/3 of Palestinians are refugees, internally displaced persons, or living in exile, not allowed to go home. Anchored in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the BDS movement has consistently opposed all forms of racism and discrimination, including anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous discrimination, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. One's identity, the movement upholds, should never diminish or restrict one's entitlement to rights. BDS targets complicity, not identity, and it views globalized oppression as requiring globalized resistance and solidarity. BDS is deeply rooted in decades of Palestinian popular nonviolent resistance to settler colonialism and is inspired by the South African anti-apartheid movement, the US civil rights movement, and to an extent, the Indian and Irish anti-colonial struggles. The BDS movement is increasingly being recognized as a significant partner in a growing international progressive wave, fighting for global intersectional justice against the forces of fascism, xenophobia, white supremacy, and savage neoliberalism. Oppressed communities worldwide increasingly view international complicity in maintaining Israel's regime of oppression against the Palestinians as undermining the very legitimacy of the law-based international order, which in turn undermines their own struggles for justice. They're increasingly recognizing Israel's regime as including apartheid, a crime against humanity, and crucially, they're endorsing Palestinian calls for targeted and lawful sanctions to bring an end to Israel's decades-old violations of Palestinian rights under international law. For example, in a Global South response last year to the United Palestinian appeal for lawful targeted sanctions to stop Israel's apartheid regime and planned de jure or official annexation on top of de facto annexation in the occupied territory, some 10 former presidents of Latin American countries, as well as South Africa, hundreds of parliamentarians, elected officials, academics, artists, civil society leaders from Asia, Africa, Latin America have endorsed sanctions against Israel. The Senate of Chile voted overwhelmingly for sweeping sanctions if Israel went ahead with its formal plans, as did the parliaments of Belgium and the Netherlands. Such measures by governments and political figures partially explain why Israel's extremist government and its allies have intensified their war on BDS, which Israel has designated as a strategic threat since 2013. The impact of BDS campaigning at the municipal and political levels worldwide has figured prominently in an authoritative Israeli anti-BDS report that bemoaned the movement's increased sophistication and admitted that Israel has, quote, largely failed to disrupt the BDS momentum, despite its massive investment of human and material resources targeting BDS. The Palestinian-led global BDS movement faces an uphill battle against an Israeli regime that is more fanatical and violent than ever. Israel is escalating its medieval, brutal siege of 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, its incessant destruction of Palestinian homes and olive groves, its gradual ethnic cleansing of indigenous Palestinian communities in Jerusalem, the Jordan Valley, and the Naqa or Negev, its relentless theft of Palestinian land, and its wanton murder and imprisonment of scores of Palestinian men, women, and children. Israel is enjoying a disturbing level of impunity thanks to blind support from its anti-Palestinian and far-right allies in the US, in Europe, India, Latin America, and increasingly in some autocratic Arab countries as well. With all this, Israel projects an unprecedentedly powerful and invincible image, partly to colonize our minds with despair. The South African Black consciousness leader Steve Biko said, quote, "The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed." End of quote. Indeed, as early as 1923, Zionist leader Ze'ev Jabotinsky wrote with lucid honesty, quote, "Every native population in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized." He goes on, "Zionist colonization must either stop or else proceed regardless of the native population, which means that it can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an iron wall which the native population cannot breach." End of quote. Aside from its more recent concrete wall, Israel has incessantly been constructing its iron wall in Palestinian minds by trying to reduce us to lesser humans, or what I call relative humans, humans only in the relative sense, isolating us from our environment and the world, and trying to sear into our consciousness through sustained hegemonic violence the imperative of submission to its indomitable power as fate. The most important goal in colonizing the minds of the oppressed is to insidiously imprint in them the lethal futility of resisting ongoing oppression. Consequently, the struggle for Palestinian liberation has always been conditioned upon decolonizing Palestinian minds from deeply seated powerlessness and hopelessness, and embarking on a praxis, a radical process of hopeful, globalized resistance, transformation, and emancipation. After all, hope that emanates from effective popular resistance, organically coupled with principled international solidarity, is resilient and contagious. Despite decades of ruthless Israeli ethnic cleansing and settler colonial brutality, the Palestinian people have not given up. We continue to resist oppression and to assert our quest for emancipation and self-determination, as well as equal rights for all.